We're not quite in offseason mode in the NBA, but things are going to heat up once we get there. Before we even crown an NBA champ, the rumblings of stars switching area codes has been circulating around Giannis Antetokounmpo and Kevin Durant, some of those stars that could be chasing a Larry O.B. in the future. They're not the only ones, so buckle up because it's going to be a hot summer across the association. It always is, but this year maybe a little different. Our Sam Quinn has put together 11 tiers of possibilities of up to 100 players that could be moving to different teams. Of course, starting there with Tier 1 with the stars, all the way down to Tier 11 when it comes to the breakdown of matching salary, multiple-year contract tiers. But, of course, you can check all that out on CBSSports.com. But taking a look at that first tier, as I mentioned there, when it comes to 1 and 2, you see those names I mentioned. Kevin Durant, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Jaylen Brown has been part of the conversation in Boston, surprisingly, after securing the bag not too long ago. Other stars like Lauri Markkanen, Trae Young, Ja Morant, Zion Williamson, Jaren Jackson Jr., and then Tier 2, the salary dump. Dame, of course, will be out likely next year when it comes to that ACL. Jeremy Grant and John Kachar there for Memphis. So we'll see how that all pans out, of course, this summer. Now, the man subscribing us all to this madness, here he is. You can look at him, Sam Quinn. He will be busy this summer. But real quick here, Sam, can you kind of break down, we're looking at over 100 players in your article. Of course, different tiers. Give us a skinny of what you're looking at.
Yeah, it all starts with the top two players, right? We're waiting to hear if the Bucks are going to trade Giannis. We don't know if they've met yet, but we presume that's going to happen relatively soon. And then Kevin Durant, we've kind of had an idea that was coming since February. They tried to trade him to Golden State. It didn't work. He didn't want to go there. We think they're going to trade him somewhere. Those two players are kind of the two that unlock the market. That's going to show us which teams are really serious about making a big move to try to get into the championship picture for next year. It's going to show us who's willing to give up a lot. And it's also going to show us which teams are desirable in this market, right? When you're talking about stars of this caliber, you're not just going to trade them without talking to them. You're not going to trade them without their consent. Where they want to go is ultimately going to matter. So we're going to see, do they want to go to Houston? Do they want to play with those young defensive players? Do they want to play with Victor Wembanyama in San Antonio? Are there surprise teams out there? Those two players are going to dictate the market, and everything that happens afterward is going to depend on what happens with them.
Sam, you got to touch on it there. I want to touch on, too, KD and Giannis, because, as you mentioned, those are the two dominoes. Usually we get one, and then everything kind of trickles in when it comes to those free agents. But out of those two, who's the bigger domino, I guess you could say, between Giannis and KD that can get the ball rolling here in that Tier 1?
Well, they're interesting in that they're pretty different as trade candidates, right? Giannis is an MVP in his prime. Very, very few players of that caliber are ever traded. So if you want to say who's the bigger domino, it's Giannis. He means more. He's the kind of player that every team in the NBA should be trying to get. But that also means he's going to be prohibitively expensive, right? There are going to be a lot of teams that just don't have the assets to get Giannis. Durant's different. Durant is 37. He's on an expiring contract. He's plausibly acquirable to most of the league. It's going to depend on where he wants to go, right? With that expiring contract, he has the leverage to turn away teams that he doesn't want to go to. So with Giannis, you're probably looking at a relatively small group of suitors, right? Not many teams can win a bidding war against Houston or San Antonio. With Durant, it's a wider field. You could maybe talk yourself into Minnesota. You could talk yourself into New York. You could maybe even talk yourself into Denver. So they're interesting for different reasons. I think both of them are going to activate different parts of the league. But ultimately, I think Giannis, just by virtue of the rarity of a player of his caliber becoming available, is probably the bigger domino and the one that unlocks more players potentially entering the market.
By the way, he even has his own tier in Tier 3 and some of those players that could be moved for Giannis. I want to take a look at that and kind of break it down for us when you talk about the Greek Freak possibly on the move there, but the options that teams will have to maybe go grab him and maybe land a Larry O.B. in the future.
Yeah, you know, there are certain players that just are not or normally would not be available on a trade, right? Like Amen Thompson would never get traded 99.9% of the time. But if you have a chance to get Giannis Antetokounmpo, you kind of have to think about it, right? It's the same with Alperen Şengün. It's the same with Stephon Castle, who just won Rookie of the Year. These are guys that normally would just stay with their teams. But when you have a chance to get Giannis, things change, right? And that's not just young players. there are veterans that are in that camp too. You saw Jimmy Butler on that list. You saw Draymond Green on that list. The Warriors, under most circumstances, would not trade Draymond Green. They wouldn't trade Jimmy Butler 2 months after getting him. Well, you have a chance to pair Stephen Curry with Giannis Antetokounmpo. You kind of have to think about it. So what I would broadly say for that only for Giannis camp, it only lists, I think, 8 or 9 players. The true number of players that are on that list is much, much longer. Almost anybody in the league could plausibly be involved in a Giannis trade because Giannis is that good. It would have been faster to list the players that wouldn't get traded for Giannis, right? It's Jokic, it's Wemby, it's a very, very short list of guys. So only 8 or 9 players listed there. What I would tell you with a Giannis trade is expect the unexpected. Almost anybody could be in it.
Interesting to see how that pans out there. Of course, you had 2 players for the Warriors and 2 players for the Rockets. And like as you said, generational talent, you give it up. Some big cap hits there in Tier 3. That brings me to Tier 6 with big contracts and bad fits. One of those names I was looking at, Jalen Green, a part of the conversation. We saw 2 of his teammates there in that Giannis tier. It doesn't seem like he's more of that star anymore in Houston because of the emergence there of Şengün and also Min Thompson. But break down what we're seeing here in Tier 6.
Yeah, Jalen Green is a pretty interesting case. I think there will be teams around the league that look at his athleticism and look at the regular season scoring numbers and see a possible star, right? I think that upside still exists. But remember, they have a Min Thompson who's on the rise, who's going to need the ball a lot more than he had it last year. They have Reed Shepherd, who they drafted number 3 overall last year and barely played. He's going to have to make it into the rotation. Suddenly, ball handling minutes, guard minutes in that rotation are starting to get rarer and rarer. And that's before we even talk about them making a star trade. I think if they make a star trade in their perfect world, Jalen Green would be the matching salary just because you don't want to give up Şengün, right? And maybe you give up Fred VanVleet, who's on an expiring contract at a big cap number, but he's very important as far as getting that offense set. He's the veteran point guard in there. So I think if they were to trade for Durant, for instance, I think they'd love to have Fred VanVleet with Durant. So that makes a logical trade, a starting point with Jalen Green, some other picks, some other young guys, some other salary. But I think generally when you look at the version of the Rockets that you expect to contend over the next few years, if they make a big move, I think there's a big chance Jalen Green is in that trade, because there just isn't space for him to grow into that same big role that they maybe envisioned in the past.
That's when it comes into the apron 1 and apron 2, and you're the king apron talk. That's what I called you off camera. I'm gonna keep that rolling here. Tier 8, because things are maybe that shake-up tier, and one name that comes to mind, Karl-Anthony Towns. Look, he's been getting a lot of flack that we saw in that previous series in the East about his defensive play, and there's been rumblings about, if you have a chance to get Giannis, that's a guy you would move. You see the cap hit at $53 million, still well into his prime, but notable names here along with Cat. What do we see here?
Yeah, Cat is the most interesting player in this tier, I think, just because there is a chance, despite coming 6 wins short of a championship, that just having Karl-Anthony Towns and Jalen Brunson on the same team sort of caps you, prevents you from winning a championship because they're both so vulnerable on defense. The Knicks aren't trading Jalen Brunson. He's one of those few guys that we couldn't fit into any one of these tiers. But Cat's pretty interesting, right? They got him almost circumstantially. Mitchell Robinson was hurt. They didn't have anybody to play center. Well, Mitchell Robinson's back now. The impetus to get Cat part of it is gone. I think they would consider moving him for a star. Giannis, of course, they'd probably do that in a heartbeat. Something else we've got coming out on CBS Sports today, would they consider trading him for Kevin Durant? I think the answer to that is maybe. There were some rumblings around the deadline that they had some mutual interest with Durant. He's the logical contract to put in that trade. So ultimately, look, there are 2 ways you can look at this Knicks season, right? Getting 6 wins away from the title, getting closer than you've been since the year 2000, you could call that a success. But they also lost the Eastern Conference Finals with home court advantage. This was probably their best chance at winning a title, at least as far as circumstances playing out, will be for the next few years, right? Like, you might never have another season where the best team presumably gets hurt in the middle of a series with you, or the 64-win team loses to the other side of the bracket. They had a real chance. They didn't take advantage of it in that Pacers series, and I wonder if there's going to be enough frustration in that front office to consider something more drastic. So I don't think it's likely that Towns gets traded. I also wouldn't rule it out.
Sam, you have walked yourself into a segment tomorrow morning. Congratulations, my friend. That's how you sign yourself up the day before. Appreciate it. I appreciate it, Tully, as well. One quick one for you, though, because a lot of big names here. Kevin Durant, Giannis, Karl-Anthony Towns. We saw Jimmy Butler, Amin Thompson. Could this be the most exciting or more of a, let's say, hurricane of an offseason that we've ever seen in terms of free agency and trades here?
So the gold standards on this front, I would say, are 2010 when LeBron went to the Heat. 2019 when Durant went to the Nets, Kawhi went to the Clippers. When you look at these famous off seasons, the ones that we look at as the landmarks, it's usually free agency based, right? It's usually one or two first team All NBA guys changing teams, 4 or 5 All-Stars. This offseason is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to happen through free agency. There aren't even really stars available in free agency. And even if there were, there isn't any cap space to sign them. The Nets are the only team with any financial flexibility. This is going to be a very different sort of offseason. It's going to be an offseason of trades because there are so many teams that are either unhappy with where they are or desperate because one of the aprons, or just see the fact that Giannis or Durant or somebody like that is going to be available and pounce in a way that they usually might not. So it's going to look different, but I am in the camp that this is going to be one of the craziest off seasons we've ever seen through trades. I think, we could see 4, 5, 6 really significant moves involving several good players, maybe even all-stars. I think there were 8 players in that star tier. When the dust settles, I think 3 or 4 all-stars at least are going to get traded.
Wow. That would be a major move this summer into 2025. As always, Sam Quinn, you are on the money. Appreciate your time, my friend. Can't wait to see what happens in the association. The conversation will continue beyond the arc. The fellas were down in. I hope they were listening to Sam because he had the good stuff. We'll see if they can follow up there. All you got to do is subscribe wherever you get those pods.